So as you prepare for this histology quiz, think about 4 locations. Always ask yourself, where are we in the GI tract? Where are we? In the GI tract. We're going to start in the esophagus. We'll go to stomach. And we'll go to small intestine. Now in the small intestine, you should be able to recognize duodenum, jejunum, ileum. And we'll go to the large intestinal colon. I turn the lights off. This is pre-labeled, so. We're in the esophagus. This is what you're looking at, the GI tract wall of esophagus. And so the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is mucosa, submucosa. 3 and 4 are muscularis externa. 3 is the circular layer. 4 is the longitudinal layer. It's not staying very well, but number 5 is serosa or adventitia. Esophagus. There it is unlabeled. Here's a closer up picture of mucosa. The mucosa, number 1 is the epithelium. This is a stratified squamous epithelium. So, you swallow your food, you didn't chew very well, you have sharp potato chip shards, and this is for protection, right? You can slough off the apical layers, and the basal layers will replace it. Well, anyways, stratified squamous epithelium, number 1. Number 2, lamina propria, connective tissue. Number 3, muscularis mucosa. Okay, that's what I'm going for there. There it is unlabeled. This is still esophagus. This is the mucosa from here to here. Moving on, stomach. There are different regions of the stomach. Don't bother which region you're looking at. Just know that this is stomach. So 1, 2, 3, 4, going from outer to inner this time. Serosa adventitia, muscularis externa, submucosa. 4 is mucosa. Now for 4, you should recognize the little pit, gastric pit versus gastric gland deeper in the mucosa. So I kind of point to it more closely here. Number 1 is muscularis mucosa. Number 2, that's the gastric gland there. That's where you got the mucous cells, the parietal cells, chief cells. You don't have to identify those individual cell types. Number 2 is gastric gland. That's what you got to know. Number 3, gastric pit. If I point to a pit, it's gastric pit. This is still stomach. Okay. 1, 2, 3 is the tri-layered muscularis externa. Longitudinal, circular, oblique. Once again, longitudinal, circular, oblique. Number 4, submucosa. Number 5, mucosa. Now, I didn't point to it, but if I pointed to a pit, that's it. And these little pits on the surface, and deeper in would be the gland, the gastric gland. Okay. So that's stomach. Moving on from stomach, this is small intestine. What's the first part of the small intestine? Duodenum. And how you can tell that is, I'll have you identify number 6, the Brunner's glands. 6 is Brunner's glands. In terms of layers, number 1, going from outer to inner, serosa or adventitia. 2 and 3 are muscularis externa, longitudinal, circular. Okay. Number 4 is the submucosa, which contains the Brunner's glands, and number 5 is mucosa. There it is unlabeled. Moving on to jejunum, but this is only the mucosa. But number 2, I could have pointed to any of these big long arms. It's all villi. Yeah, villi. Villi number 2. Number 1, crypts, the intestinal crypts. Now, there's a fancier name I still use, is the crypts of Lieberkühn with panic cells. So if you ever see that term on a quiz, I should write that on the board. Crypts of Lieberkühn with Paneth cells. The easier term is intestinal crypts, also known as crypts of Lieberkühn. With Paneth cells. The Paneth cells are in both, whichever term you decide to use. It's the same thing. But if it's a multiple choice format, which your quiz is, I may have used one or the other, so I guess you better know both. Remember, the arrangement of the mucosa in small intestine is it's villi, crib, right? So cribs are secreting things to help absorption. Let's move on from jejunum. This is just looking at the crypts of the jejunum, I should say. The reddish cells are considered the Paneth cells, and they're always there. They're always like modeled or labeled. I'm going to move on from jejunum. This is ileum, and number 4 is ileal malt, M-A-L-T, the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. And so malt's huge, and it's a can't miss, and this is how you know you're looking at the ileum. Okay, so that's your clue. Malt, that's ileum. So the layers, 1 and 2, we start with the Muscularis Externa, serosa. I guess it got sloughed off in tissue preparation. Well, anyways, it's always the inner circular and the outer longitudinal. So number 1 is the longitudinal layer, circular layer. Number 3, it's all submucosa. Number 4 is malt. Number 5, mucosa. Number 6 is pointing to the MM, the muscularis mucosa there. So this is ileum. There's a blank picture you could study. Now where are we in the GI tract? Well, what's the last part we're going to know? That's colon, and I always look for the 2 big slabs of prime rib there. That's Muscularis Externa, okay? Because let's remember, the colon has to move your fecal matter along. So I expect a very sturdy looking, well, anyways, circular layer of Muscularis Externa, longitudinal layer of Muscularis Externa. Number 5 is the serosa or adventitia. Number 2, submucosa. Number 1, just mucosa. There's a picture of malt. Well, I'm not pointing to it, but do you see it? Big purple splotch right there. Well, I call it a purple splotch. The cells are the lymphocytes. They take up a purple stain. So the Muscularis Externa, okay, circular, longitudinal layers, submucosa, mucosa. The striking thing about the colon are the goblet cells. The goblet cells. I point to 1, but they're all over the place, right? The goblet cells have a very important function to help keep you regular. There's a case, and I can't remember the cause, but the disease, it prevented, well, it was a failure of the goblet cells. And Professor Woolsey, who told me about the case, she used to be a nurse. In her nursing days, she would go to this guy's house and give him these massive enemas. He had lost the function of his goblet cells, so he couldn't move his own bowel. And she would go there maybe just once a month. And which tells me you can hold out for a whole month before you need one. And I can't imagine what comes out after a month, which is probably why she described it as massive. But that's not the remarkable part about the case. The remarkable part about cases are kind of the personal things you hear. Like this guy, he had this affliction for decades, his whole life, and he never told his family, his kids, his wife. They never knew. So here's this nurse coming to his house, you know, and she's writing him checks, and he kept it a secret. It's kind of, those are the interesting parts, I think. It's like you can have a nurse come to your house for months, for decades of your life, and nobody knows. Have these massive enemas, okay? Well, anyways, I always were reminded of that case. Goblet cells are important, okay? Otherwise, you need enemas your whole life. And that's what I learned from that case. All right. Now let's go ahead and take a break. Stop this.